Welcome to Season 2 of True Gay Crime. It has been a minute, and I'm happy to be back bringing you true stories of queer crimes and criminals. Remember to subscribe and like if you're listening on YouTube, to rate and review on Apple Podcasts, and to tell a friend about true gay crime. And if you're able to, supporting on Patreon really does help keep the show alive. The link to my Patreon is in the show notes or in the description on YouTube. And as always, the sources for this episode can also be found in the show notes or in the description on YouTube. Season 2 starts with a biggie. We've all heard the story, probably watched Evan Peters play him on TV, or seen one of the countless documentaries. It's not an unknown story, but it's an essential one if we're discussing gay crimes. This is the story of the Milwaukee Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer. True Gay Crime contains coarse language, adult themes, and content that is violent and disturbing. If at any time you feel you need help, please refer to the toll-free crisis lines in the show notes. A naked 14-year-old runs for his life. He's running from a tall, blonde guy in his smelly apartment. The guy had left him alone, and he knew that this was his chance to get away, even if the drugs he was given were making him drowsy. It's just before 2 in the morning, and Sandra Smith calls 911 to report a naked boy running around frantic. When the paramedics arrive, they put a blanket around the boy. When the cops show up, they try to understand why the boy, a young man of Asian heritage, is naked and scared. Then, the tall blonde man returns from running his errand and sees the police with the boy. Sandra, the 18-year-old girl who made the 911 call, stands nearby with her cousin. The tall blonde man tells the cops that the 14-year-old boy is 19 and, in fact, his boyfriend. He tells them that his boyfriend drinks too much, and the boy, too drugged and confused to contradict his story, stays silent. The cousins speak up against the boy, who looks frightened and was trying to get away, but the cops don't listen to the girls, even when the girls point out that the boy has blood on his testicles and rectum and is seemingly struggling against Dahmer. The officers tell the girls to butt out, shut the hell up, and to not interfere. You see, the police don't care as much for the South Asian boy. They listen to the white man who's calm and coherent. They don't want to deal with the hassle of a gay domestic, but to be on the safe side, the cops follow the men home to the apartment. The first thing they notice is the smell, something like excrement, but the place is very tidy. The boy's clothes are folded neatly on the sofa, and there are Polaroid pictures of him wearing black bikini briefs. I suppose they do know each other, thought the cops. The tall blonde man apologizes for the disturbance and promises it won't happen again. The boy sits on the couch, unable to talk. In a neighborhood like this, the cops have other things to tend to, and they leave the boy behind, telling the man to take care of the boy, and they list the incident as a domestic dispute. But you see, what they missed that night was Tony Hughes's decomposing body in the very next room on the bed. What the cops didn't do was take the name of the tall blonde man from his ID and run it through a background check. A background check that would have shown the cops that this man was Jeffrey Dahmer, a convicted child molester on probation. The girls who called 911 don't feel good about the situation, so they go home and tell Sandra's mom. She calls the cops to express her concern and asks about the Asian boy. She's told, he's not a child, he's an adult. It's all taken care of. I can't do anything about somebody's sexual preferences in life. A couple days later, the mom reads a newspaper article about a missing Laotian boy named Conrad Sinthasamphone, who looks like the boy from the previous night. She calls the cops. Nothing. She calls the FBI. Nothing. Nothing comes of anything until a couple months later when all hell would break loose. Let's start at the beginning, with Jeffrey's childhood. He's born May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee. He's the oldest of 2 boys to Joyce Annette and Lionel Herbert Dahmer. Some reports say he's ignored as a kid. Others say that he's doted on. His mom is known to be tense and greedy for attention. She likes to be pitied. She's argumentative with her husband and neighbors. She's a hypochondriac, suffers from depression, needs constant attention, spends a lot of time in bed. She attempts suicide by taking Equinil, which is used to treat symptoms of anxiety and nervousness. His dad is away much of the time working on his PhD as Dahmer enters first grade. So it actually sounds like he is ignored. Despite that, Dahmer is happy and bubbly. He loves his dog named Frisky. As a kid, Dahmer rescues a baby bird and nurses it back to health and releases it into the wild. But that joy for life doesn't last. Because when Dahmer is 4, his dad finds the remains of small animals under the house killed by other larger animals. His father remembers Jeffrey seemed oddly thrilled by the sound they made. His small hands dug deep into the pile of bones. I can no longer view it simply as a childish episode, a passing fascination. The same sense of something dark and shadowy, of a malicious force growing in my own son, now colors almost every memory. As a young boy, he suffers from a double hernia, which is the abdominal wall is weak and that starts to bulge, and he has corrective surgery for that. He becomes more inward after that, quiet and sitting for long periods of time alone and motionless. At school, Dahmer is quiet, he's timid, but he does have some friends. In October of 1966, the family moves to Doylestown, Ohio. During the pregnancy, his mom's symptoms of depression get worse, and Joyce gives birth to her second boy. Dahmer picks the name David. The same year, Lionel gets his PhD and starts work in nearby Akron, Ohio. He's a workaholic, and he's rarely at home. Then, as we've seen in so many other similar cases, Dahmer becomes interested in dead animals very early on. He collects large insects, he likes dragonflies and butterflies, he collects animal carcasses and dismembers them at home or in the woods. He keeps the parts in jars in the family tool shed. He even decapitates a dog's head from the carcass, nails the body to a tree, and impales the skull on a stake. In 1967, the family buys a new house. Dahmer makes a friend, Lee, and gives his teacher a bowl of tadpoles he caught in the creek. But when he finds out the teacher gave the tadpoles to Lee, Dahmer goes to Lee's garage and kills the tadpoles with motor oil. Kind of strange that the teacher gave away Dahmer's present to the other kid. I don't know why she did that. As he matures, his behavior deteriorates from his posture to his attitude. From 10 to 15, he becomes a different person. He looks tense, he's shy, he prefers being alone. Disengaged is probably the best word to describe him during this period of time. He was riding around with plastic bags, collecting animal remains for his own private cemetery. He strips the flesh off the bones and mounts skulls on stakes. There's debate whether he tortured animals, but this seems unlikely since he had pets he loved and a fish as an adult. He was fascinated with the creatures once they were dead. So much so that he asks his dad during a chicken dinner what would happen if he put bones in bleach. His dad tells him how to use bleach and preserve bones, and Dahmer uses this technique moving forward. His mom ups her dosages of Equinil, laxatives, and sleeping pills, making her less and less available for her family. Now Dahmer's in high school, and he's an outcast. At 14, he's drinking beer and the hard stuff during the day, sneaking booze into school. He's described by teachers as polite and intelligent with average grades. He's a good tennis player and plays briefly in the high school band. At puberty, he realizes he's gay, and he has a brief dalliance with another boy, but he doesn't tell anybody. He starts fantasizing about dominating and controlling submissive male partners. He later admits that when he's masturbating, he's thinking about chests and torsos and intertwining it with dissection. He has a fantasy about knocking out this jogger that he sees all the time, having sex with his unconscious body, and even waits in the bushes for him with a baseball bat. But the jogger doesn't show up that day. It was his first attempt at an attack. The only attention he gets from others is acting out as the class clown. He does strange things like pretending to have a seizure at the store, calling any weird behavior doing a Dahmer. By now, he's answering people with one-word answers that are barely audible, and dead objects have become the primary focus of his sexual desires. Unable to talk to anyone about this, he's completely isolated from the world and drinks heavily. He's unmotivated, isolated, uncommunicative. Nothing seems to matter to him. By 1977, his parents are in counseling to try to save their marriage, but Joyce's affair comes out and the couple decides to divorce in September of that year. They try to divorce amicably, but they fight over custody of Dahmer's brother David, ignoring Jeff completely. Joyce gets custody and alimony. Dahmer ups his drug and alcohol intake as he graduates from high school. Joyce and his brother David move out of the house, leaving him basically alone in the house at 18. 3 weeks after his graduation, the real nightmare begins. It's 1978, and he's driving when he sees a bare-chested hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks on the side of the road. Dahmer decides to pick up the 19-year-old. He lures Stephen home with the promise of drinks and weed before Stephen continues on to the rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. Dahmer has the place to himself, and the boys drink and listen to music, but after a while, Stephen says he's got to leave for the concert, but Dahmer doesn't want him to go. So he comes up behind Stephen with a dumbbell and hits him over the head twice. While he's unconscious, Dahmer takes the barbell bar and strangles him to death. He strips the corpse and masturbates over it. The next day, he dissects the body and buries it in a shallow grave in the backyard, only to dig it up a few weeks later, pares the flesh from the bone, and dissolves it in acid. This is his first murder, and it sounds like he already has his MO pretty figured out. Then he crushes the bones with a sledgehammer and scatters the remains in the backyard. His first murder under his belt, and no one is the wiser. 6 weeks after the murder, his dad Lionel and his new wife Sherry come home. Lionel and Sherry try to convince Dahmer to go to college in the fall of '78. He starts at Ohio State, but he's drunk all the time and he flunks out with a .45 grade point average after only 3 months. Angry because he paid for the schooling his son will never finish, Lionel lays down the law. Either Dahmer gets a job or he joins the army. Dahmer refuses to get a job and continues drinking, so his dad drives him to the recruiting center and he joins the armed forces in January 1979. He trains as a medical specialist in San Antonio, Texas, and then he's deployed to Baumholder, West Germany. According to reports, he's an average or slightly above average soldier, but he's an alcoholic and his performance suffers, and in March '81, he's deemed unsuitable for service and he's discharged. When he gets back to the U.S., they give him a plane ticket to wherever he wants. He's scared of his dad's reaction to the discharge and opts instead to go to Miami Beach to start fresh. He lives a modest life there, working at a deli and renting a room in a motel, spending all of his cash on booze. Eventually, he misses home and calls his dad and returns to Ohio. Back at home, he lives with his dad while he's looking for work, but he's drunk all the time and is arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct 2 weeks after returning home. Exasperated, his dad gives up on him and sends Dahmer to live with his granny in West Allis, Wisconsin. His grandmother seems to be the only family member Dahmer shows any affection towards. These living arrangements also seem to work for a while. He does chores around the house, he accompanies her to church, and finds work at a blood clinic for 10 months until, of course, he's laid off. He's in his early 20s now, and he's basically living off of the generosity of his granny during these years. It's around this time that Dahmer exposes himself at the Wisconsin State Fair Park in front of young boys, and he's arrested for indecent exposure, paying a $50 fine. Then in January '85, he gets a job as a mixer at a chocolate factory, working nights 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 nights a week. He's fully comfortable with his homosexuality at this point, and he starts going out to the gay bars, bathhouses, and bookstores. When he does have sex with other men, he's frustrated that they keep moving, like physically moving. So he steals a male mannequin from a store and brings it home to have sex with. His granny finds it in the closet, tells him to get rid of it. Also, to keep partners from moving so much, in June of '86, he starts giving guys sleeping pills and liquor with sedatives to make them pass out. Once they're unconscious, he takes advantage of them sexually. After 12 reported incidents like this at a local bathhouse, he's banned from going and starts using hotel rooms instead. Now, to keep his drug supply going, he tells doctors that he works nights, which is true, and that he needs the sleep aids to help his body adjust to sleeping during the day. So we know he doesn't like sexual partners moving, and that's how Dahmer gets the bright idea to dig up a fresh corpse from the ground. He hears about an 18-year-old who just had a funeral and tries to dig up the body, but the ground is too hard, and he gives up. In August of 86, he's arrested again for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys by the Kinnickinnick River. Sorry if I butchered that name. He gets 1 year of probation and has to undergo counseling. By now, it's been 9 years since his first kill. Although he's been drugging and sexually abusing guys while unconscious all of this time, he's about to start murdering again. It's the fall of 1987, and Dahmer is still living with his grandmother when he meets 25-year-old Stephen Toomey at a gay bar called Club 219 and lures him back to his hotel room at the Ambassador. Dahmer later explains to authorities he only planned to drug Stephen and explore his body. But when he wakes up in the morning, he finds Stephen's chest crushed in and covered in bruises with blood seeping out of the corner of his mouth. Dahmer himself has his forearms all bruised up and has zero memory of what happened the night before. To get rid of the body, Dahmer buys a suitcase and transports the corpse to his grandmother's, where he severs the head, arms, and legs from the torso. He fillets the bones and cuts the flesh into small pieces. He puts the flesh into garbage bags and wraps the bones in a sheet and pulverizes them with a sledgehammer. Then he takes all of the remains and puts them in the trash, saving the head. The whole process takes him 2 hours. He keeps Stephen's head wrapped in a blanket for 2 weeks before boiling it in a mixture of Soilex, which is industrial detergent, and bleach to preserve the skull, which he uses afterwards for stimulation. After Stephen's murder, a switch is flicked on in his brain, and he actively seeks victims. So moving forward, Dahmer has an established MO. This gets really graphic, as if it hasn't been graphic so far. So in any case, there's a bit of a trigger warning here, but I rather do this all at once instead of detailing each and every murder and dragging out the gruesome. So this is the MO. I'm going to do it once. He meets boys and men in and around gay bars and bus stops, and he invites them to his place, offering them cash to watch porn or pose for nude and semi-nude photos. Once at home, he crushes up prescribed sedatives like triazolam or temazepam and serves them in a drink. Now, this drugging thing isn't new. We've heard this a few times with the grinder killer Stephen Port and with the serial rapist Reynard Sinaga, of course. Once his victims are unconscious, Dahmer strangles his victims with his hands or a leather strap. Then he has sex with the corpse, later masturbating on it or using parts for stimulation and even sodomizing one of them. And like so many before him, I can remember the collector Robert Berdella did the same thing. Dahmer takes Polaroids so that he can remember every murder. He starts by cutting open the torso, later saying he gets sexually aroused by the heat coming from the inside. And he takes more Polaroids of the entire dismemberment process, photographing every stage. He gets rid of most of the bodies by experimenting with different chemicals and acids that would dissolve the flesh to a sludge. Then he pours it down the drain, which reminds me of a lot of Dennis Nilsen from the UK, from season 1. That's also how he got caught, if you heard that episode. He keeps certain body parts as trophies, depending on the victim, sometimes the genitals, sometimes the head. On his motivation of why he keeps body parts of his victims, Dahmer would later say, "It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. I also wanted to keep, if I couldn't keep them there with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons." He preserves the genitals in formaldehyde and boils the head until the flesh comes off. Once the skull is bare, he paints it gray to make it look like plastic, should anyone ask. It seems he keeps parts of the guys that he covets the most. Sometimes it's the genitals, sometimes it's the head or the skin or bicep. Of course, there's also the cannibalism, which harkens back to our German story in season 1 with Armin Meues, the Rottenburg Cannibal. Dahmer would later say that by eating his victims, he thought that they would become alive again and that consuming human flesh gave him an erection. He tries seasoning the meats and tenderizing it to make the flesh more palatable. His freezer contains strips of human flesh from different parts of the body along with the heads. Control is an essential part of Dahmer's MO. Like so many other killers, he cannot stand to be rejected, and the mere thought of abandonment is enough to trigger him. He has no intention of ever pleasing his partners. It's all about his own pleasure, and that pleasure for him means performing oral and or anal sex on his victims, whether they're alive or dead. In his need for control, he tries different techniques to subdue his victims, even drilling holes in their skulls and injecting acid or boiling water in their brains. Usually the victim would die immediately, but at least one lived for a few days like this. Okay, so now we have his MO. Let's get back to the crimes, which come fast and furious. I won't go into the gruesome details for each one, but I will mention when something changes or there's something new to the situation. On January 16th, 1988, Dahmer meets 14-year-old James Edward Doxator outside a gay bar in Wisconsin. Dahmer offers him $50 to pose for some nude pics. He murders the boy and keeps his body in the basement for a week before dismembering him and discarding the remains in the trash. March 24th, 1988, 22-year-old Richard Guerrero is lured back to Dahmer's bedroom where he strangles the young man. The body is brought to the basement for dismemberment with parts dissolved in acid. He bleaches and keeps the skull for months as a trophy. It's in September 1988 that Dahmer's granny has had enough of her grandson bringing young men into her house late at night and the terrible smells coming from the basement and the garage. So she gets Lionel, Dahmer's dad, to come over and check things out. He finds black sticky residue in the house, similar to what dissolved flesh does in acid, but he doesn't really care about his son or what he's up to, so he ignores this complete red flag about Dahmer, saying he's experimenting with animals. Lionel is fine with that explanation, but Dahmer's granny doesn't really believe him, so she tells him to get the fuck out, and he finds a one-bedroom apartment on North 25th Street. The very next day, in his brand new place, Dahmer drugs and molests a 13-year-old boy named Keeson Synthasifone that he lured to his home on the pretext of money in exchange for nude photos. But the kid gets away, runs to the cops, and tells them everything, and Dahmer is arrested. At this point, his dad doesn't really know the extent of what's going on because he's actually hired an attorney to defend his son. The attorney suggests Dahmer undergo psychological tests before the trial. The evaluations show Dahmer has issues. He has deep feelings of alienation. He's impulsive and suspicious of others, along with a schizoid personality disorder. 4 months later, in January 1989, he's convicted of second-degree assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes. Sentencing is suspended until May, before which Dahmer moves back in with his granny. I mean, this poor woman. So here we are, 2 months after his conviction and 2 months prior to his sentencing for sexual assault, and Dahmer murders another victim. On March 25th, he drugs and strangles 24-year-old Anthony Lee Sears, whom Dahmer met at La Cage, which is a gay bar. Anthony is the first victim where Dahmer permanently keeps a trophy because he found Anthony so attractive. His skull and genitals would be found 2 years later upon Dahmer's arrest. The next month, he lures another young man. He literally doesn't take a break. It's literally one after another with this. I mean, we're still waiting for his sentencing for the sexual assault, and he's going around killing. So he brings this guy home. They're in the basement. He pours him a drugged coffee. The guy drinks it, but before passing out, they both hear Dahmer's granny calling to them from upstairs, "Is that you, Jeff?" To which Dahmer responds, "Yes," trying to mislead her to think he's alone. But she knows he's not. He panics, and instead of murdering the young man, he takes him to the hospital for the drugged coffee. Finally, on May 23rd, 1989, the final arguments are presented. The DA wants Dahmer to get 5 years imprisonment, saying, "In my judgment, it is absolutely crystal clear that the prognosis for treatment of Mr. Dahmer within the community is extremely bleak. His perception that what he did wrong here was choosing too young a victim, and that's all he did wrong, is a part of the problem. He appeared to be cooperative and receptive, but anything that goes below the surface indicates that the deep-seated anger and deep-seated psychological problems that he is unwilling or incapable of dealing with." 3 psychologists conclude that Dahmer is manipulative, resistant, and evasive, and they recommend intensive treatment and hospitalization. The defense claims that Dahmer is just a sick man who needs treatment, not prison time, saying, "We don't have a multiple offender here. I believe that he was caught before it got to the point where it would have gotten worse," which means that this is a blessing in disguise. A blessing in disguise. Yeah, tell that to the victims. And in his defense, Dahmer says, "What I have done is very serious. I've never been in this position before. Nothing this awful. This is a nightmare come true for me." For you? "If anything would shock me out of this past behavior patterns, it's this. The one thing," he continues to say, "the one thing I have in my mind that is stable, that gives me some source of pride, is my job. I've come very close to losing it because of my actions, which I take full responsibility for. All I can do is beg you to please spare my job. Please give me a chance to show that I can tread the straight and narrow and not get involved in any situation like this ever again. This enticing a child with the climax of my idiocy, I do want help. I do want to turn my life around." The judge falls for the act. Hook, line, and sinker, and Dahmer is only sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction with a work release permit so that he can keep his job. Oh, he's also required to register as a sex offender, obviously. When you register, then you're not able to live in certain places. In many cases, being a registered sex offender means you will be denied housing by certain landlords, or you may not be allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. And there might be difficulty finding employment. 2 months before the end of his stay at the House of Correction work camp, he's paroled and finds a new home in May 1990 at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The neighborhood is bad, but it's close to work, it's fully furnished, and super affordable at $300 per month, all in. Within a week, he meets 32-year-old sex worker Raymond Smith at a tavern. He offers him money for sex, brings him home, and murders him. After dismembering and dissolving the body, he takes the skull and spray paints it gray so anyone would think it's fake, and he puts it in the filing cabinet next to Anthony's skull. A week after that, Dahmer brings home another young man, but this time the idiot drinks the laced drink himself and passes out. While he's unconscious, the guy totally robs him, taking $300 and a bunch of clothes and a watch. Of course, Dahmer never reports the robbery. The next month, Dahmer murders 27-year-old Edward Warren Smith. This guy was actually a known acquaintance of Dahmer, and they had been seen at a party together. Then the next month, in July 1990, Dahmer decides to shake things up a bit. He lures a 15-year-old Hispanic boy to pose for pictures, but instead of drugging him, Dahmer decides he'll just try to bash his head in with a mallet. The kid fights back, escapes, and goes to the police. Unfortunately, the boy isn't out to his foster parents, and he begs the police not to have them involved, and eventually the whole thing is dropped, which, if somebody comes to you with this and you don't follow through regardless of the parents, 2 months later in September, Dahmer meets 22-year-old Ernest Marquez Miller outside a bookstore. Dahmer was especially attracted to Ernest's dancer body, and he keeps the legs and biceps and heart in the freezer to be consumed later on. Later that month, Dahmer meets 22-year-old David Courtney Thomas near the Grand Avenue Mall. He's brought back to Dahmer's on the promise of cash for posing nude, but once the young man is unconscious, Dahmer decides David is not his type, but he kills him anyway, taking Polaroid photos of the entire process. During the next few months, he tries unsuccessfully to lure guys back to his place. Not surprisingly, during these months, Dahmer reports to his probation officer that he suffers from anxiety, depression over his sexuality, solitary lifestyle, and financial difficulties with thoughts of suicide. 5 months after his last kill, Dahmer meets 17-year-old Curtis Correll Straughter in February of 91, standing at a bus stop near Marquette University. He offers Curtis money in exchange for photos. After all, Curtis was an aspiring model. The boy is then drugged and handcuffed before being strangled to death while giving Dahmer oral sex. 2 months later, in April, Dahmer meets 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, a heterosexual young man going to get a key cut. This is the first victim Dahmer practices drilling into the skull and injecting liquid into. In this case, he injects hydrochloric acid into the brain, but Errol actually wakes up from this. Dahmer was hoping would induce a permanent, unresistant, submissive state. Errol wakes up saying, "I have a headache, what time is it?" is drugged again, and then murdered. Drilling is something you might remember with also from season 1 Robert Berdella and his House of Horrors Unsurprisingly, around this time, his neighbors of the Oxford apartments complain of really terrible smells coming from apartment 213. That, along with the occasional sound of falling heavy objects and the sound of a chainsaw, was too much. So the building manager reaches out to Dahmer to see what's up. Dahmer cooks up a story about his freezer breaking and the food spoiling inside, and on occasion telling the super that his tropical fish died and he needs to dispose of the dead fish. The next month, in May, Dahmer meets 31-year-old Tony Anthony Hughes at Club 219. Tony is a deaf mute, and the two communicate using handwritten notes. Dahmer offers to pay Tony for nude photos before being murdered in Dahmer's apartment. Later that same month, Dahmer meets 14-year-old Conorak Synthasamphone. This is the young boy from the opening story of this podcast and the younger brother of Keeson Synthasamphone, who was also lured to Dahmer's place and drugged, but got away and reported him to the cops. Remember, then Dahmer was arrested and only got 5 months probation? What wasn't mentioned in the story at the top of the episode is that Dahmer injects hydrochloric acid into his brain and then leaves the boy alone while he goes out for beer. And that's when he returns home to find the boy naked, disoriented, out on the street with the two local girls who had called the police. Of course, as we know, the police are useless here, and they leave the boy with Dahmer, who injects more acid into the boy's brain, which kills him. The next month, it's June, and it's Pride Month in Chicago, and Dahmer meets Matt Cleveland Turner, 20 years old, at a bus stop. He convinces Matt to come to Milwaukee to pose for photos. They take a Greyhound bus for the 90-mile journey, and once at Dahmer's, Matt is drugged, strangled, and dismembered. A week later, back in Chicago, Dahmer meets Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberger, 23 years old, at a gay bar. Jeremiah is there with his roommate and even asks what he thinks of Jeff. The roommate gives an A-OK, saying he seems all right. So Jeremiah goes with Dahmer to Milwaukee, ostensibly for the weekend. They have mutual sex before Dahmer drills a hole in his skull and pours boiling water on his brain. Dahmer would remark later that Jeremiah was the only victim to die with his eyes open. That same month of July, on the 15th, Dahmer meets Oliver Joseph Lacey, a 24-year-old bodybuilding enthusiast. Dahmer lures him home with the prospect of photos for cash. This time he wants to prolong the time that Oliver is alive and tries using chloroform on him. He fails and then has to drug and kill him. This is also the first time he sodomizes the corpse. His skeleton was destined to be one side of the private shrine Dahmer was in the process of creating at this time. The shrine was to be a private altar of victims' skulls he would put on display on a long black table in the living room. Each side of the table was to have a complete skeleton. The skulls on the table were to have incense sticks with a large blue lamp over the table. The table was meant to be placed before a window covered in a black opaque shower curtain, in front of which Dahmer planned on sitting in a black leather chair. He would later say that the altar was dedicated to himself and was meant to be a place of meditation, telling officers if they had discovered him 6 months later, they would have found a complete altar. So he calls into work to take another day off to dismember the body, which he's been doing a lot of lately, so he gets the day, but is suspended the next day and fired 4 days later from the chocolate factory. He's pissed. So on that day, Dahmer meets his last victim, 25-year-old Joseph Arthur Bradehoff, at a bus stop in the pouring rain, holding a 6-pack of beer. Joseph is a father of 3 from Minnesota, and he's looking for work in Milwaukee. He takes up Dahmer on the proposal of cash for photos. They drink the beer and party a bit before Joseph is murdered in Dahmer's bedroom. And finally, after years of murdering young men and boys, on July 22, 1991, Dahmer goes up to 3 men and offers them $100 to pose for photos, drink beer, and keep him company. 2 men refuse, but one guy, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agrees to the proposal and follows Dahmer to his apartment. Tracy enters the apartment and first notices the smell, a rancid, putrid smell he can't quite place. Next, he sees boxes of hydrochloric acid, which Dahmer explains he uses to clean bricks. The 2 men chat a bit, then Dahmer points out the aquarium, to which Tracy turns his head to look. When his head is turned away from Dahmer, Tracy feels the cold metal of handcuffs being closed around his wrist. Tracy demands to know what's going on, and Dahmer tries quickly to cuff the other wrist, unsuccessfully. He changes tactics and tells Tracy to follow him into the bedroom to take nude photos. As he steps into the bedroom, Tracy notices posters of nude men all over the walls, and on the TV plays the movie The Exorcist 3. In a corner of the room is a blue 57-gallon drum reeking of something horrible. Dahmer reveals a large knife and tells Tracy that they're going to take some nude photos. Tracy, not wanting to piss off the man with the knife, starts unbuttoning his shirt. His mind is racing what to do and how to get out of there. While he's undressing, he notices Dahmer has turned his attention to the movie playing on TV, rocking back and forth and chanting something under his breath. Then suddenly Dahmer races over to Tracy, puts his head on his chest to hear his heartbeat, and says, "I'm going to eat your heart." Obviously horrified, but trying to appease Dahmer, Tracy assured him that they were friends and he wasn't going anywhere, but that it was hot in the bedroom and couldn't they just sit in the living room with the AC and have a beer instead. Dahmer agrees and the two men sit on the couch sipping beer. Tracy decides his best options are either to jump out the window or make a run for the unlocked front door. He asks Dahmer to use the restroom. Dahmer is a bit distracted, says yes, and when Tracy stands up, he notices Dahmer isn't holding onto the handcuffs anymore. He decides this is his best chance, and he lands a punch right on Dahmer's face and races out the front door. On the corner of North 25th Street, Tracy flags down two police officers and explains to them that for the last 5 hours he's been held against his will by a psychopath who's tried to cuff him. The cops try to remove the cuff, but they don't have the right key. So the three of them go back to the scene of the crime. When the cops knock on the door of apartment 213, a tall blonde man answers the door. They enter to find a tidy apartment, and the man confessing that he is the one that cuffed Tracy. As the cops question him further, Dahmer loses his patience, yelling, "I just lost my job and I want to drink some fucking beer." They ask where they can find the keys to the handcuffs, and Dahmer points to the bedroom. But as one officer starts to head in that direction, he realizes his mistake. There's a giant gallon dissolving body parts in there in the corner. So he tries to pass the officer to get the keys himself. The second officer sees this and tells him to back off. Things are starting to quickly go downhill for Dahmer at this point. In the bedroom, the cops find a large knife hidden under the bed. An open drawer was home to over 75 Polaroid photos, which upon inspection were of human body parts in various stages of dismemberment. One of the cops utters out loud, "These are real." Knowing he's now royally fucked, Dahmer tries to overpower the cops, but he's quickly overtaken and cuffed, and a second squad is called as backup. While they wait for backup, the cops start searching the apartment, and the gruesome horror they find must have been seared into their minds forever. Inside the fridge, they find a freshly severed head, 2 human hearts, and a portion of an arm muscle. In the freezer, they find an entire torso and a bag of human organs. They find 3 more severed heads in the kitchen. They find 7 skulls. Some are painted, some bleached inside of his bedroom closet. Elsewhere, they find 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and 3 torsos slowly dissolving in acid in the gallon drum. Dahmer is cuffed and he's pinned to the floor, and he turns his head to the officers and he says, "For what I did, I should be dead." In reference to the recovery of body parts at 924 North 25th Street, the chief medical examiner later states, "It was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene." And just like that, the case becomes the biggest serial murder case of the decade. At first, his bail is set at $1 million, but is quickly raised to $5 million. Then 8 more murders are added to the charges. Eventually, Dahmer would accumulate 15 murder charges. Unlike other serial killers, Dahmer is quiet in the courtroom. In fact, the longest sentence he utters is in response to the question, "Do you understand the charges against you?" To which he replies, "I understand, Your Honor." On July 13th, 1992, Dahmer defies his lawyer and pleads guilty by reason of insanity. His lawyer has to change his whole approach to the case and needs to prove that his client didn't know what he was doing and is therefore not responsible. In his confessions, all 160 pages of it, detectives state that Dahmer felt a tremendous amount of guilt because of his actions. He felt thoroughly evil. Here's a direct quote from the confessions. "It's hard for me to believe that a human being could have done what I've done, but I know that I did it. The confessions start in July 1991 with Detective Patrick Kennedy. Detectives conduct numerous interviews with Dahmer over several weeks for a total of 60 hours. He knows he's caught and he's not trying to escape, so Dahmer waives his right to an attorney and admits to having murdered 17 men in total. When talking about his increasing killings, Dahmer says it was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with somebody at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long. Back and forth in the courtroom trying to convince the jury that Dahmer was in fact insane, his defense attorney draws a chart for the jury to help them understand his client better. On the chart he writes skulls and locker, cannibalism, sexual urges, drilling, making zombies, necrophilia, drinking alcohol all the time, trying to create a shrine, lobotomies, defleshing, calling taxidermists, going to graveyards, masturbating. This is Jeffrey Dahmer, a runaway train on a track of madness. Doctors say that Dahmer suffers from borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, and a psychotic disorder. Psychiatrist Park Dietz testifies that, again, Dahmer didn't suffer from mental illness at the time of the murders, but that Dahmer went to great lengths to be alone with his victims and to have no witnesses. He explains that Dahmer prepared in advance for the murders and that Dahmer's habit of getting shit-faced drunk before the killings was significant. If he had an impulse to kill or a compulsion to kill, he wouldn't have to drink alcohol to overcome it. He only has to drink alcohol to overcome it because he is inhibited against killing. Dietz also notes that Dahmer identifies with evil and corrupt characters from both The Exorcist III and Return of the Jedi, two movies he would watch before going to find a victim. The prosecution continues with that train of thought, saying he wasn't a runaway train, he was the engineer. There's also two court-appointed mental health professionals that testify neither for the defense or prosecution that say the murders came from pent-up aggression within himself. He killed those men because he wanted to kill the source of his homosexual attraction to them. In killing them, he killed what he hated in himself. They concluded that Dahmer is a sexual sadist with antisocial personality disorder, but he's legally sane. Then on February 15th, the court convenes to hear the verdict. The jury enters the room and says Dahmer is sane and not suffering from a mental disorder during the murders. Formal sentencing is 2 days later. Dahmer approaches the lectern and reads from a prepared statement, which says, "Your Honor, it is now over. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did, but not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. I know how much harm I have caused. Thank God there will be no more harm that I can do. I believe that only the Lord Jesus Christ can save me from my sins. I ask for no consideration." Now, the death penalty is not an option for Judge Graham in the state, so Dahmer gets 15 consecutive life sentences for a total of 957 years in prison. When they hear about the sentence, his dad Lionel and stepmom Sherry ask to say their goodbyes to Jeffrey Dahmer. They get a 10-minute private meeting to say goodbye. 3 months after the conviction, he's extradited to Ohio to be tried for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. The hearing only lasts 45 minutes. He pleads guilty and gets a 16th life sentence in May 1992. He's then transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage, Wisconsin. For the first year, they keep him out of the general population for fear of his safety. Eventually, and because he's kind of a model inmate, he gets to mingle with the other prisoners, eating with them and getting janitorial work to do, like cleaning toilets. Then after his confessions are complete, he asks for a copy of the Bible. They give him one, and he devotes himself to Christianity and becomes a born-again Christian. In 1994, he's baptized by a minister in the Church of Christ. While he's in prison, his dad and stepmom maintain regular contact with him. Even his birth mother, Joyce, comes back into the fold and calls him weekly. When his mom expresses concern over her son's safety in prison, Dahmer says, "It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me." On July 3rd, 1994, while attending a chapel service, Dahmer is attacked by a Cuban inmate he had never seen before. Then, on the morning of November 28th, 1994, Dahmer leaves his cell to do his assigned work. He's accompanied by Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scraver. The three men are unsupervised in the shower of the prison gym for about 20 minutes. And that's all it takes. At 8:10 a.m., Dahmer is discovered on the floor of the bathroom suffering from extreme head wounds inflicted by a 20-inch metal bar. He's still alive and rushed to the nearby hospital, where he's pronounced dead 1 hour later. Christopher Scraver, imprisoned for a murder from 1990, admits freely to the murder, saying that Dahmer didn't even make a sound when he was being attacked. Scraver returns to the cell after attack and tells the guard, "God made me do it." Scraver tells authorities that he attacked Dahmer with a metal bar. He's adamant that he did not plan the attack in advance, but brought a metal bar with him to do his chores. So he also says that he killed Dahmer because he was repulsed by his crimes, and according to Scraver, prison guards knew how much he hated Dahmer and placed them together unsupervised on purpose. When she hears of her son's death, Dahmer's mother, Joyce, says to the media, "Now is everyone happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone?" Response from the victims' families is mixed, but there's a general feeling of relief. Dahmer is cremated in September 1995, and his ashes divided among his parents. On August 5th, 1991, a candlelight vigil is held to celebrate and heal the Milwaukee community, and it's attended by more than 400 people, including gay rights activists, community leaders, family members of several of Dahmer's victims. Organizers state the purpose of the vigil is to enable Milwaukeeans to share their feelings of pain and anger over what happened. The Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street, where Dahmer killed 12 of his victims, are demolished in November 1992. Lionel Dahmer is retired now and lives with his second wife, Sherry. In 1994, Lionel publishes a book called A Father's Story and donates a portion of the proceeds of his books to the victims' families. Mother Joyce Flint dies of cancer in November 2000, and Dahmer's younger brother, David, changes his surname and lives his life in anonymity. And so concludes the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Yowza! Well, as I mentioned at the top of this story, I mean, it's a story that we all know, we've heard. I think the reason it's been covered so much is it's fascinating that he had so many victims, and then when he was caught, had this kind of, I think a lot of times we want these people to be monsters and completely unempathetic and not realize what they did. And I think it makes it more difficult to stomach and understand when the person is caught that they know that they've done wrong and that they don't deserve anything from us and that they should be punished, which makes the whole thing, I think, less easy to digest and a lot more confusing, especially with the victims and the crimes being as brutal and grotesque as those of Jeffrey Dahmer. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next episode of True Gay Crime. Did you know you can subscribe, rate, and review True Gay Crime on Apple Podcasts? It would mean everything to me if you did, because it helps me create content you like, and it lets Apple know to share it with more people. Thank you for listening. And remember, always look behind you, lock your doors, tell someone where you're going, and look out for each other.
Why can't we all just get along?